Hi, my name is Adam Janke. I'm the Extension Wildlife Specialist here at Iowa State. And I'm going to talk today about ways to help wildlife and talk about wildlife habitat. And what I came up with was initially 4 ways to help wildlife on every farm. But I have an exciting announcement. We have actually 5 ways to help wildlife on every farm. In preparing for the talk, I thought really there is a 5th one that I should be attending to. So I'm going to talk about that as well. In my work, I do education on all things wildlife and wildlife habitat. And I'm always excited to talk to agricultural producers about these things because in Iowa, of course, the vast majority of our land area is privately owned by farmers and landowners. And the vast majority of our land area is touched by and used for agriculture. And so I'm excited to share with you 5 simple, relatively simple ideas to get you started about thinking about how you can help wildlife and wildlife habitat on your farm or any farm that you have influence or impacts on. And so I'm going to jump right into it and actually share with you the 5 ideas that I have to talk about today. And then we're just going to walk through each one of these 5 ideas one at a time and hopefully give you some ideas. Perhaps you don't need to do all of these, but some ideas of things that you can take home to your farm or farms that you have impact or influence over and apply to improve conditions there for a diversity of Iowa's native wildlife species. So the first one I'm going to talk about is improving habitat in existing natural areas. And this is one that we probably think of the most as wildlife biologists and people interested in wildlife habitat. Is managing wildlife habitat in timbers or managing wildlife habitat in prairies or wetlands or lakes. And this is certainly something that a lot of professional wildlife biologists have a lot of interest and expertise in. So, and it's also something that can be done on most farms because most farms have areas that are outside of the production operation. For the rest of the ideas that I'm going to share with you, the 4 other ways or rules for improving wildlife habitat, I'm actually going to talk mostly about things we do as part of the production operation. But here, we're going to talk about what's going on the edges or outside of where we're farming. And for each one of these 5 ideas for improving wildlife habitat, I'm going to tell you a story about one example from Iowa of people applying the practice to benefit wildlife and wildlife habitat. And so the first example I'm going to share is this one. Pictured here is my friend Dave. Dave lives on a farm in Hamilton County along the Boone River. And Dave's pictured here in the lower left-hand corner looking out on a what we call goat prairie or a hill prairie where he's put a lot of work in to improve the wildlife habitat found there. And so this area may not look all that remarkable, but it's a unique ecosystem in Iowa where prairie environments go out on flat fingers or steep hill slopes on ridges in forested environments, especially along a lot of river breaks. And so in this case, the river was the Boone River. These are also very common in southern Iowa and eastern Iowa, for example, along the Mississippi River. So what Dave did on this area is he tells a cool story. He was driving by this piece of small patch of prairie one day, didn't know it was back there in his woods, and he just happened to, in the middle of summer, catch a glimpse of a purple coneflower, which is the main flower that you see in bloom here in the prairie. And he thought, well, that's weird for a purple coneflower to be in the middle of the woods. And he walked in there, and sure enough, he found a bunch of native prairie plants that were increasingly being shaded out by the encroaching forest canopy overhead. What we know about goat prairies or these hill or bluff prairies is that they are threatened by encroachment by woody plants in the absence of disturbances that favor prairie environments, mainly fire or grazing. And so Dave knew that this area hadn't been burned or grazed for a long time. And so he went to work clearing out some of those trees that were taking up the sunlight away from the prairie, and then using prescribed fire in this area over multiple years. And now it's this really remarkable ecosystem. Depending on where you are in the state, this ecosystem can be really important to some species of Iowa's wildlife. Lots of birds would forage on a place like this, and we even have rare species like in southern and eastern Iowa, the timber rattlesnake that's really dependent on bluff prairies like this, or the federally endangered rusty patch bumblebee, who spends half of its life in the forest and half of its life in the prairie, and therefore benefits from these places where prairie and forest meet. So it's a cool example of one way that you could improve, or one example in this case of what Dave did in Hamilton County to improve wildlife habitat in existing natural area on his farm without impacts to the adjacent production operation. There's a million different ways that you could improve habitat in existing natural areas. And this talk there's no way we'll be able to attend to all of them. Some examples are interseeding. If you have a grass planting, like a CRP planting or something else, where you have a lot of prairie and maybe the grasses become overabundant, you can interseed more plant species, native flowering plant species, and improve it for wildlife habitat. You could strategically use what we call disturbances, like fire, grazing, or even appropriately timed and planned haying to improve or enrich the habitat value of a prairie or a wetland environment. You could do what we call timber stand improvement. This is both economically a good idea for your timber stand to select potential future harvestable trees, and it's also often very good for wildlife and wildlife habitat. And you could do that in your timbered acres. And in all of the ecosystems, all the natural areas where you have influence, it's important to understand, to identify, and start to control invasive species. Now, we have college degree programs in this at Iowa State. We have graduate degree programs in this at Iowa State. It would take a long time to get caught up on and tell you everything you could about just this one rule for improving wildlife habitat on your farm. We're not going to get to it today. So one thing is you can contact some of the professionals that I'll talk about at the end. The other thing is I'm going to quickly plug a program that we have here in Extension, where if this is something that really interests you, you think you're interested in managing natural areas on your farm, I would encourage you to check out the Master Conservationist program, because that program really takes a deep dive on Iowa's 3 major ecosystems: aquatic ecosystems, forests, and prairies, and gives landowners and people that manage land all sorts of ideas about how to improve those areas for wildlife and other natural resources purposes. So check with your local county extension office about an offering of this, and hopefully you could catch one of those soon if this number 1 rule is something that appeals to you. Now, our second rule, or our second way to improve wildlife and wildlife habitat on every farm, is to mow less and mow less often. And this is a rule that I offer in any context that I get an opportunity to do so. That is because we mow a lot of areas that we really just basically don't have any better ideas of what to do with them. Big expanses of yards on rural farmsteads, or around livestock production facilities, or around like agricultural co-ops and rural landscapes. We see lots of mowed grass, and we just do that because we really just don't have any better ideas of what to do with it. We'd like to offer you a better idea of what to do with it, and that is to create pollinator habitat for a diversity of native bees and butterflies and insects like the monarch butterfly that really need nectar resources and places to raise their young during the summer, and it can be really beautiful. So to tell you a story about who's successfully pulled this off, I'm going to share with you a story that I suspect many of you have already heard, and that's Wayne Frederick's work on his farm. And this is a picture of Wayne here, and this is actually just a picture that I snuck of Wayne during a presentation he gave once at a monarch butterfly field day, talking about what he's done on his farm to find opportunity areas for pollinator habitat in areas that were otherwise just mowed or idled. And so that's what's pictured here in the background. These were barns that Wayne keeps some of his equipment in, and he was coming and going from these a couple of times a year, but then frequently mowing the grass around them for no reason other than that's just what he had always done. And so when he started to learn about the plight of the monarch butterfly and get interested in conservation efforts directed at them, he decided to convert those areas that were otherwise just mowed to pollinator habitat, a rich diversity of native grasses and wildflowers like pictured here, that doesn't need mowed anymore, only needs occasional mowing and management. He can still drive his equipment back and forth across this. It's aesthetically beautiful, and it also provides really good wildlife habitat. So that's just one really cool example, and Wayne's done this at a bunch of different places across his farm, and it's a really neat example that we'd love to see more people in rural landscapes take up as an opportunity to improve wildlife habitat on the edges of the production operation. So we've actually just recently completed an analysis on the financial considerations for converting yards to pollinator habitat. And there's a real compelling case to be made here as well. So here's just a picture of one of many examples. We've all driven around in rural Iowa and we know what these look like, of many examples of big tracts of lawn that are not managed for anything other than the aesthetic pictured here. And these are the areas where we see a lot of opportunity for creating pollinator habitat instead of just annually mowing them. And we also learned from our economic analysis that there's a clear economic case to be made. So an economist here at Iowa State, John Tyndall, did some calculations on this, and he estimates that to contract mowing of one of these yards, it costs about $627 per acre per year. That's to cover the cost of the equipment, the cost of the person's time, fertilizer inputs, and herbicide inputs as well. So that's what we anticipate about an average cost over a 10-year planning horizon. If we take that same 10-year planning horizon, we convert that lawn to pollinator habitat, like shown here from a park in Lynn County, we estimate that it costs $111 per year per acre to establish and maintain that pollinator habitat over a 10-year period. Now, that doesn't mean it's going to be $111 in the first year and in the second year and so on and so forth. Those expenses will actually be mostly front-loaded in the establishment phase of pollinator habitat, but in the end, after a 10-year period, it can represent an 83% cost savings from mowing areas in our yards, like 1 acre of yard, versus converting it to pollinator habitat. And then there's all sorts of additional benefits: water quality benefits, soil health benefits, carbon storage benefits, and what I'm talking about, wildlife habitat benefits that are pretty exciting. And we want more people to consider this as an alternative to managing these big patches of turf grass that we have in Iowa. There's been some really neat work on this with some pork producers, and this is one example of a project that the Iowa Monarch Conservation Consortium, housed here at Iowa State, was involved with, where they just took some mowed turf grass outside of a hog production facility and converted it into pollinator habitat, and have been really pleased with the results, both aesthetically and also in the reduced amount of time that it takes to maintain those areas. And there's a really neat video on the Monarch Conservation Consortium's website all about this approach to converting mowed turfgrass areas and putting them into pollinator habitat that I encourage you to go check out at this website. The last thing I wanted to point out in this rule for mow less and mow less often is that you could also apply this on the home place. And that, of course, depends on where it is. What I have pictured here is something more like what we would imagine in a urban setting. But this would apply, of course, on a farmstead as well. And that is basically just to landscape more and be more creative with the spaces that we use, especially if you can use native plants and mimic natural features in your landscapes, like is pictured here. That can be a lot better for wildlife. And if you consider our rural landscapes, particularly during the wintertime, places where people live are some of the best places for wildlife to make a living during the wintertime as well. That's where we find a lot of trees and shrubs and other grassy areas. And so we can make a real difference by creating wildlife habitat right in the places that we live. And so that's another consideration in our mow less often rules. Our third rule is to create wildlife habitat in profit loss areas or odd areas on the farm. And so there's a couple of ways to explore this, and we're going to walk through them. But I'm going to start with this picture, and this picture is from a farm in Des Moines County by Ryan Heininger, that Ryan Heininger farms. And Ryan works for Pheasants Forever, and he also farms with his family down in southeastern Iowa. And this is a ditch that goes through their farm pretty close to the Mississippi River. And it was always odd to farm along that sort of jagged edge of that wooded ditch. And so what they decided to do was actually work with the CRP program and square up the field. And so here's what it looks like from an aerial photograph up above that wooded ditch in the picture. And they just took grass and enrolled it in a buffer program of the CRP and squared up the field on each side, and then provide wildlife habitat directly adjacent to the creek. And I've hunted this with Ryan actually, and I can attest there is certainly some good pheasant habitat down there, and lots of other species of wildlife will take advantage of these areas, and it makes the fields a little bit easier to farm with modern equipment and other considerations. So that's an odd area on a farm, or could be a profit loss area. There's also lots of other profit loss areas on the farm that we think are real opportunity areas to introduce native perennial vegetation back into our working landscapes, where we aren't making money, but we're putting money into them to try to farm them, but we consistently lose money on these parcels in our crop fields. This is a map from a study that was published in 2018 from Iowa State that estimated 12% of cropland acres in Iowa lost over $100 per 2.5 acres, basically, every single year in, I think, a 5-year monitoring program. So 12% of Iowa's cropland acres are losing money every single year. And that's what we want to look for in finding opportunity areas to create wildlife habitat on farms. And so there's a couple of ways you could find these. I don't think it's particularly hard in some cases, areas that drown out every single year, almost every single year. This is actually just an area north of town here, north of Ames here, that I've taken a picture of, I think, every year that I've lived here for the last 5 growing seasons, and it has never produced a crop. It always floods because it's a prairie pothole wetland that's been modified by drainage, but not enough that allows for a crop to grow out there. And so it's clearly an area of profit loss. That's just from intuiting, just driving by and looking at it, or driving from the combine and being able to see as well. We can also do this a little bit more rigorously, for example, with yield map data. And this is an example of a farm in north central Iowa where we've looked at some yield map data, and we know there's areas where there's consistent profit loss, and those may be areas where we could reimagine uses for those portions of the field and increase net profitability in the rest of the acres by taking those profit loss areas off the balance sheet. We've done some monitoring as part of a project that I'm going to mention. There's another Crops TV episode about in some of these areas. So here's a half section of land in Boone County that we've been doing some monitoring on the last 2 years. So it's a mile across the bottom, a half mile across the top, just to give you some context. It's a 310 acre field, and there's these 4 wet spots out in the field that consistently would be profit loss areas. They were enrolled in the Conservation Reserve Program and squared up to allow for easy farming around the edges. And in total, it creates 62 acres of grass. Here's what they look like from the ground. They're kind of hard to picture, of course, from the ground, but just a square parcel of native warm season grasses and wildflowers out in the middle of the field that they farm around. And we've done some monitoring on 13 fields that look just like this in the same general area in Boone County the last 2 years. And we've sent interns out to look for things like milkweeds and monarchs, and we found in every single one of these areas that were once just unprofitable areas of a crop field, just didn't grow crops, but they put a lot of inputs in and there wasn't really any wildlife habitat. We find if you create wildlife habitat, take those profit loss areas off the balance sheet, you can grow a bunch of monarchs. We found monarchs in every single one of the fields, and we documented 22 different species of birds using these areas. And some of these birds are rather rare species of greatest conservation need. So it's a real neat opportunity area to create wildlife habitat and also benefit the farmer or the landowner. So if you want to learn more about this, please check out our other episode of Crops TV, where Dr. Mark Licht and I talked about this project in more detail. And Mark, of course, as an agronomist, provides a little more tangible guidelines for how it is that you could find these areas in your fields and think about converting them over into native perennial vegetation to create wildlife habitat and improve farm profitability. Our fourth rule for finding ways to create wildlife habitat on every farm is to layer upon one another the work of wildlife conservation, soil conservation, and water conservation. And of course, each of these considerations are really important in stewarding our farms for today, and importantly, stewarding our farms for the future. We want to make sure that we have rich, healthy soils, clean water leaves the farm, and wildlife are able to survive there, in addition to making a living. And so what we get excited about in our education, our natural resources and land stewardship education here at Iowa State, is that there's a lot of places where all three of these things can just logically stack right on top of each other, benefit the farmer, benefit the landowner, benefit the water, soil, and the wildlife in sort of a win-win all the way around. And so I'm going to share a couple of those examples here. This is a crepe wetland, a wetland that's created to be fed drain tile from a small watershed. These are targeted wetland constructions in Iowa that are designed to allow for the natural process of denitrification to occur, to take nitrates out of the water and send the water cleaner downstream to downstream cities or ultimately to the Gulf of Mexico, where nitrate problems create challenges for water municipalities or harmful algal blooms, or in the case of the Gulf of Mexico, hypoxia in the Gulf. So what we want to do is try to treat that nitrate here by allowing for conditions that create that allow for denitrification, like in wetland ecosystems. Well, we also know that lots of Iowa's wildlife and many wildlife species that are of conservation concern in Iowa are found in wetland ecosystems. And here's one of those, a trumpeter swan, a really neat conservation success story in Iowa. They were once very common in Iowa. They were driven out of Iowa entirely and have today come back. And this is a wildlife biologist with the Iowa DNR. He's also a graduate student at Iowa State, Tyler Harms. And what he's bear hugging is a young of the year trumpeter swan. If you believe that, that trumpeter swan's probably only 4 months or so old. And around that trumpeter swan's neck is a pretty sophisticated piece of technology that takes GPS locations and transmits them via the cell phone towers back to the researchers at Iowa State and the Iowa DNR and tells us where that swan lived after they caught him. Well, they caught this swan on a crepe wetland, a wetland that was constructed to treat nitrates and drain tiles, but the swans thought it made for pretty good swan habitat as well as denitrification habitat, and so they took advantage of it. This is all those red dots on the map are the locations of this bird. That's Boone on the lower left-hand corner and Ames in the lower right-hand corner. And these are the locations of this bird during the first fall of its life. It was born up in Boone County on adjacent to one crepe wetland and adjacent to two others. And so once it was able to fly, it left the crepe wetland it was born on and checked out these two other crepe wetlands. And then down just a little ways further south and closer to Boone, that same swan was able to find a fourth crepe wetland and take advantage of that as well. So it's kind of a neat story about how we put these wetlands out in the landscape to improve water quality, which is, of course, a really important function and priority in our agricultural landscapes. But they also, in improving water quality, also create conditions favorable for species of conservation concern like the trumpeter swan. So kind of a neat story. If we picture across a typical farm, we can find areas to do water quality or soil health conservation practices everywhere on our farm. And that, of course, is not something that I'm going to talk about in much detail, but there's lots of other Crops TV episodes about it. And, of course, an active area of education at Iowa State and NRCS and DNR and others in the state. What I want to talk about is how many of these exact same edge of field or infield conservation practices that benefit water quality or soil health also benefit wildlife habitat. And I already introduced wetlands. Wetlands are the best example of this, where we can improve water quality and address flooding, some greenhouse gas challenges, and then we can also create wildlife habitat all in the same areas of our farm. Other examples are things like the prairie strips. Prairie strips putting 10% of a farm field into perennial vegetation can have a 90% reduction in nitrates or phosphorus runoff from the farm. And it can also really increase habitat for pollinating insects, monarch butterflies and other species of conservation concern, and many different species of breeding birds. So prairie strips are a really neat place where we can reduce soil erosion, create wildlife habitat, improve water quality, and have sort of a win-win. Other examples, in some watersheds, especially in north central and northwestern Iowa, we can restore or create oxbow wetlands, disconnected wetlands adjacent to stream channels that also do a really nice job of reducing nitrates in surface waters, especially when they're fed drain tile, and can create really good habitat for a bunch of organisms, including the endangered Topeka shiner, which this Fish and Wildlife Service biologist is holding in this picture. And then riparian buffers. I like the saying, I've never met a stream that doesn't need a buffer. And I think that's certainly true. And putting native perennial vegetation adjacent to streams and drainage ditches and rivers in Iowa can be really good for soil, can be really good for water, and can also be really good for wildlife and wildlife habitat. So that's our fourth rule. Our fifth and final rule, this is the one that I added in the last minute because I thought, oh, this is another important function. It doesn't have quite so much to do with habitat per se, but what we do that may impact animals and their habitats, even when we don't mean it to. So what the rule is protect wildlife and wildlife habitat. And there's a number of ways that we can do this. And the one that I wanted to highlight is the challenge that exotic plant species create for wildlife habitats. And so what's pictured here is what we call a native prairie. This is on an ISU research farm actually in Muscatine County near Fruitland. And this small patch of prairie just has never been plowed. It's backed by a railroad track and kind of out of the irrigation system down in the what they call the Muscatine Island, where the soils require irrigation. And so this area has never been converted from prairie and has some really unique prairie plants in it. But unfortunately, innocently enough, directly adjacent to the prairie were planted a bunch of Siberian elms, exotic species of elms that are really productive and can rain their seed down for quite some distance. And in this case, these exotic elms have taken over or started to take over this native prairie that's survived lots of pressures from other sources, and now it's being overrun by this exotic tree species. And so this is a picture of a crew, just actually probably half of the crew that we had out there one day last winter. And we cleared a bunch of Siberian elms and other species of trees invading this native prairie. And in doing so, create better wildlife habitat, better conditions for prairie-dependent wildlife out in that environment. So the recommendation is to always favor native species. We want to try to the extent possible, not plant exotic species like Siberian elm or the exotic species of burning bush or Japanese barberry in our landscapes or in windbreaks or on our farms, because those can very easily invade natural areas, and oftentimes they don't have natural predators and can become really prolific and really problematic and require a lot of hand-to-hand combat, like pictured here, to get rid of them. Another really important way to help wildlife, to protect wildlife, is to keep cats indoors. Cats are the leading cause of what we call unnatural avian mortality. So lots of birds die every year from lots of natural causes, disease, predation, etc. But the number one cause of avian mortality that is associated with humans is by allowing cats to roam freely outdoors. And so we really discourage people from allowing cats to freely roam outdoors. I do recognize that cats play an important role in many like barns and things like that. So there's a line to be drawn there. If they're playing a role in the barn, maybe try to keep them there and provide them with feed to keep them close by and minimize their impact on adjacent natural areas. But to the extent possible, we really want to encourage people to not let cats roam freely outdoors because of the billions of birds that are annually killed by cats in the United States. And then finally, this is a video here of someone mowing, and this is a CRP, and I think this was maybe just an emergency haying or mowing. I took this video this year. And what I want to draw your attention to is not that they're mowing. That's fine. Of course, that's an important and part of a production operation. But the speed at which this person is mowing is really remarkable. And sure, in many cases, the equipment may allow for you to safely mow that fast through a CRP or a hayfield or something like that. But an easy way that we can help wildlife on our farms is just to slow down when we're out mowing hay or mowing CRP or even mowing idle areas on the farm, to try to allow wildlife enough time to escape the mower. If there was a deer fawn hiding in this grass, or one of many species of Iowa's native turtles that come up into uplands during the summer breeding season and move around and lay their nests up on dry ground, they would be really hard pressed to be able to escape this fast moving piece of equipment. So we always want to encourage people to consider slowing down, always mowing during the daytime, and trying to allow wildlife time to escape. So with that, that's my 5 rules for how everybody can help wildlife on every farm. As I mentioned when I started, I don't think you necessarily need to be able to do every single one of them tomorrow. You could certainly start small. I hope you maybe got some ideas about ways that you could improve wildlife habitat on your farm or land that you have influence over. The last thing I want to leave you with is a point that there's lots of technical expertise out there to help you with these things. And there's also lots of cost share or financial incentives to help you with any sort of financial burdens that you may encumber in trying to improve wildlife habitat on your farm. The technical assistance comes from all sorts of different agencies. There's the NRCS has many people that do wildlife habitat work in their offices across the state. The Iowa Department of Natural Resources has both private lands foresters or district foresters that cover every county in the state, and private lands wildlife biologists or private lands wildlife specialists that can be available to private landowners to brainstorm ideas, find cost share, and develop plans for improving wildlife or forest resources on your land. We also have this neat network of private lands wildlife biologists associated with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and they do sort of niche things, especially targeting endangered species or threatened species or migratory birds. And if you want to especially manage natural areas on your farm, a private lands biologist with the Fish and Wildlife Service could be a real partner in that. And then finally, the Farm Bill Wildlife Biologist Program from Pheasants Forever. And there's also other groups in the state like Wildlife Management Institute or the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation that have people tasked with helping private landowners manage wildlife habitat on their farm. At the end, you'll see a link to my website and on all of these, you could go to our website, find the resource to find help or contacts to do wildlife habitat on your farm, click on your county, and find a listing of all of these different people there. And then, of course, the DNR, the USDA, NRCS, and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, among others, all have funding available to help. Here's just an example of some of the alphabet soup that is conservation programs available in the state. And again, those natural resource professionals that I talked about under the technical assistance heading there are the real contacts and sort of the gateway to get to those programs. So with that, I'm really looking forward to taking questions in the live program and hope that you can apply some of these ideas on your own farm and explore resources on our website or elsewhere to start to think about how to make that happen and make wildlife habitat better on every piece of land you have influence over. So thanks a lot and have a great day.